Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the difference in approach between Labour and the Conservatives when it comes to challenging Reform UK, who are of course taking votes from both. By breaking down the arguments each competing party wants to make, you can see that Labour have the most credible tactics for success. But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button so you stay notified. So I see that political journalists are beginning to take an interest in the different ways in which Labour and the Conservatives are approaching Reform UK. Josh Self has been writing a piece, which I'll link in the description below, about the way Labour are targeting the vulnerabilities of Farage in a way the Conservatives are not. And it echoes what I've been saying about both myself recently, especially since I discussed the way Labour are aiming to attack Reform UK on NHS policies. And let me tell you something. How do we know that Nigel Farage and Reform UK are particularly vulnerable on the NHS? Because even their own supporters are panicking. When I published the video on Labour's tactic against Reform UK, which is based on Nigel Farage discussing how he wants to change the funding model for healthcare in the UK and just talked about wanting a private insurance-based system, I was inundated with comments from Reform supporters denying it. But, I mean, let's go through a few things to begin with. So first they claim that Farage is talking about the French system. Oh, it's the French system, not the American system. But before the Brexit referendum, he talked about the Norwegian and the Swiss system of trade arrangements with the EU. But as soon as he'd got the public to vote the way he wanted them to, he immediately changed his policy. Nigel Farage provably lies. He always talks about wanting what sounds like a softer version of something, but as soon as he gets that sort of political permission to do it, all of a sudden he wants the harder version. No, he wants the American system, and he has been recorded saying so a few years ago. Second, the French system delivers good quality healthcare, absolutely, but it is not cheap. Farage says that the French spend less on their healthcare than the UK. This is absolutely not true. In fact, based on 2023 figures, the latest we have, we're way down the list. So to even adopt the French system would require at least an 18% boost in taxpayer funding. In addition, there are costs to using the French system. It is not free at point of contact. So not only does the French taxpayer pay more for it than we do, but you also have to pay extra for some treatments as well. The French system is actually one of the most expensive in Europe when you consider the state funding as well as top-up payments patients are expected to provide. Now, if people in France are happy with that, that's grand. But in this country, I don't think people are going to be happy about having to pay 18% extra in terms of taxes and then still pay for the treatment itself. But the fact that Reform supporters were trying to insist that the NHS care would always be free at point of access under Farage, when even he said in an interview last week that people should pay for treatments, he said those words, shows just how much they fear this line of attack. It is potentially effective. Now, how effective it actually ends up being depends, of course, on how effectively Labour are to get this message out to the public. But given that they have now decided to take this line, we can expect them to push it throughout the entire Parliament. And whether or not Labour end up being effective at getting the message to the public or not, they are at least using a platform on which Farage is vulnerable. You contrast this with the Conservatives, who are trying to fight Farage on his own platform. In fact, there are two grievous errors the Conservatives are making in trying to challenge Reform UK, which I have discussed many times. The first is they refuse to attack the characters within Reform. I'm not talking about personal attacks, nothing dirty like that, although they don't mind doing that with Labour. So the fact they refuse to do so with Reform UK suggests they are afraid for some reason. But they could at least point out the inconsistency in policies and their rhetoric and actions, which would not require any dirty tactics. They don't do that. Like, one of the most powerful political weapons is being able to paint senior politicians as untrustworthy or incompetent, to the point where even if voters think, well, I like their policies, but I don't think the people in charge could deliver them. You know, at the last election, the Conservatives pushed very few policies. You might imagine this is just because they couldn't think of any, but it was actually because they knew it made no difference. As of last summer, Tory policies were irrelevant. The vast majority of voters had decided that the individuals in charge of the government of the time were either untrustworthy or incompetent, or both. So the Conservatives instead tried to tar Labour with the same brush in order to try to even their disadvantage out. You know, you go back to 2019. Polling showed very clearly before and after the election, Labour's manifesto was that the individual elements were quite popular. People liked it. They just didn't believe that the Labour leadership at the time would deliver it. You know, why are the Conservatives not adopting the same tactics against Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and the rest? Why are they not pointing out that Nigel Farage is never in the country, that Richard Tice is now a part-time immigrant in an Arab country, where his partner is a full-time immigrant? When either get caught out lying, why don't they jump on it? Richard Tice recently, for example, was having to call out, there was an image of him supposedly in Dubai, and he said, this is AI, not real. And I looked at it and I thought, yeah, I believe it doesn't quite look like him. But part of his defence, he felt he had to point out why it wasn't him. And part of his defence was, it's wearing a watch. I don't wear a watch. It's like, yeah, he does wear a watch, though. You can actually find photos of him wearing one that haven't been doctored. A stupid lie, which the Tories should have pounced on. They're never going to beat Reform UK on policies, unlike Labour. So they need to fight them on fitness for office, destroy the credibility of the individuals running the party. You undermine at least some of their votes. And this should be easier than for other parties, because like the Conservatives can change their leader. They just have done. So they can sort of get a new slate. They're going to change the leader again before the election. They'll wipe the slate clean. Now, they can't do that with Nigel Farage. Reform UK are stuck with their leader. They can't change him if he becomes a liability, unless he chooses to go. But even on policy, the Conservatives are getting it wrong. They're trying to take Reform UK out on immigration. Are they crazy? Actually, don't answer that one. But how stupid is that? Nigel Farage will talk about immigration all day and all night. He's been doing it for literally decades. It's his bread and butter. He has all his lines worked out and refined. He's had years to get them right. He knows which lies work and which ones don't. He knows which lies work on which people and which ones don't. He has compelling lies for every line you can possibly come up with. Badenoch, on the other hand, hasn't studied any policy area in depth and would be found wanting in a debate on anything with an expert. But she should not be trying to take Farage on where he feels the most confident. That's mad. Where Farage is weakest is his use of Kremlin talking points on NATO and the war in Ukraine, his support for removing free at point of use healthcare, which, despite what his supporters will try and tell me, he has been recorded multiple times saying as recently as a few days ago. His support for Musk could become a weakness, but neither Labour nor the Conservatives would really be wise trying to exploit that under the current circumstances. He's also vulnerable on all the high-paying gigs he carries out when he's not in Clacton. It wasn't that long ago he was being used in an advertising campaign for gold bullion. How many Reform voters are interested in buying gold bars? Which partly answers the question as to why Farage is even talking about wanting to privatise our healthcare, because that is obviously a weakness for him. It's a way to drive a wedge between him and his supporters. So why does he do it? Why does he just keep his views to himself? Because it's easy to assume that Farage is only trying to appeal to the voters he needs to give him political power. And most of those voters are people who have been hard done by, right? But he needs funding. His party needs funding. In order to get it, he has to convince those wealthy enough to fund him of two things. First, that it is possible for him to dictate government policy at some point in the future, either by winning an election or more probably by coming to some arrangement with the Conservatives to help them win. Secondly, that he is willing to dictate the policies that his rich donors would like to see. Now, if you are a wealthy financier and you could dictate just one policy for the UK, if you could just decide one big change that a government is capable of delivering, it would be replacing the NHS with a system of private insurance. If you own shares in insurance companies able to get a slice of that action, you would make a fortune. Which is why Farage will be talking about the NHS in this way, even though it gives Labour an opportunity to weaken him. He will maybe be gambling that Labour are so crap at communicating with the public that they will fail to get the message out to the people who matter, and even if they do, they won't be persuasive enough to make it count. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe for further content. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can click the join button for memberships. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.